Today's episode is sponsored by Birch Gold Group. Now, before we get into today's show, I want to thank everybody who joined my first holiday giveaway. But in case you missed it, don't worry. The holiday season is not over. We're just getting started. Go to winlarry.com right now. I'll have another giveaway waiting for you. This Christmas, we are so proud to give you something I know many of you have been asking for. That's right. For the first time ever, we are giving away a full subscription to the Epoch Times. You'll get a weekly print paper delivered to your door, plus access to all of the Epoch Times digital content, including Epoch TV, where you can watch my full 1-hour show without censorship. I promise this is going to be one of the best gifts you're ever going to get. Besides, what's a better way to celebrate Christmas than having a reliable source of honest news delivered to your door? So what are you waiting for? Just go to winlarry.com right now. I will announce 3 lucky winners live on my show on December 23rd. Do not wait. Go to winlarry.com right now. That's winlarry.com. Speaking of reparations, should we get them from Africa and from the Arab Muslim world? What do I mean? Here's a movie called The Woman King starring Viola Davis, supposedly, quote, based on true powerful events, close quote. The plot is described in IMDb. A historical epic inspired by true events that took place in the Kingdom of Dahomey, one of the most powerful states of Africa in the 18th and 19th centuries. How historical? Critic Robert Daniels, who mostly praised the film, said, "You might wonder how the director can shape a tale centering the warriors, an all-women group of soldiers sworn to honor and sisterhood, hailing from the West African Kingdom of Dahomey, when one considers their hand in perpetuating the transatlantic slave trade." End of quote. Other reviews were a little more blunt about the historical inaccuracies. There was, in fact, a band of warrior women in Africa called the Dahomey, and they were fierce, feared, and frequently bloodthirsty fighters. But they used that ferocity to kill and conquer other Africans for sale to slave traders. Indeed, the transatlantic and the Arab-African slave trade could not have occurred without the complicity of African chiefs who sold conquered Africans to European and Arab slavers. A review of the movie called The Woman King Historical Embarrassment puts it this way. The movie has been set up as having a historical basis, telling the story of the real-life Kingdom of Dahomey in the 18th and 19th centuries. In reality, Dahomey was a notorious slave kingdom and not the Pan-African freedom fighters as the movie presents them. They enslaved and murdered hundreds of thousands from other tribes and sold them into the slave trade. Dahomey was renowned as the Black Sparta and was a fiercely militaristic society bent on domination and conquest. Their soldiers struck fear into other tribes all along what is still known as the Slave Coast, as they captured tribe people from enemy tribes and sold them as slaves. End of quote. In the film, white slavers are the enemy, when in reality they were business partners with the women kings. The review continues. Even worse, for those who struggle with reality, the Amazons were formed from the king's third-class wives. These were considered insufficiently beautiful to share his bed and who had not borne children. Awkward, end of quote. Another review called History versus Hollywood writes this. In real life, the Dahomey were much more villains than heroes. The Kingdom of Dahomey was a bloodthirsty society bent on conquest. They conquered neighboring African states and took their citizens as slaves, selling many in the Atlantic slave trade in exchange for items like rifles, tobacco, and alcohol. Many of the slaves they sold ended up in America. There are accounts of Dahomey warriors conducting slave raids on villages where they cut the heads off the elderly and ripped the bottom jawbones off others. During the raids, they burned the villages to the ground. Those who they let live, including children, were taken captive and sold as slaves, end of quote. The truth is, as I wrote in my testimony before a congressional committee considering reparations, is as follows. Slavery, sadly, has been part of human history since the very beginning. Muslim slave traders took whites out of the Mediterranean area and enslaved them in northern Africa. Europeans enslaved Europeans, Asians enslaved Asians, Africans enslaved Africans. Even Native Americans enslaved other Native Americans. The Arab slave trade took more blacks out of Africa for a time and for a longer period of time than did the European slavers. In a book called Prisons and Slavery, John Dewar Glassner writes, quote, the Arabs' treatment of black Africans can aptly be termed an African Holocaust. Arabs killed more Africans in transit, especially when crossing the Sahara Desert, than Europeans and Americans in over more centuries, both before and after the years the Atlantic slave trade ended. African slaves transported by Arabs across the Sahara Desert died more often than slaves making it through the Middle Passage to the New World by ship. In 2018, the Washington Post wrote an article about Benin, a country in West Africa, that was erecting museums to, in part, acknowledge their slave trading history. Here's what the Washington Post said. For over 200 years, powerful kings in what is now the country of Benin captured and sold slaves to Portuguese, French, and British merchants. The slaves were usually men, women, and children from rival tribes, gagged and jammed into boats bound for Brazil, Haiti, and to the United States. The trade largely stopped by the end of the 19th century, but Benin never fully confronted what happened. The kingdoms that captured and sold slaves still exist today as tribal networks, and so do the groups that were raided. End of quote. Where's that movie? You know, I made a video for Epic Times about the European African slave trade and the Arab Muslim African slave trade. Here's part of it. You know, one of the reasons I believe that the reparations movement has gained steam is because so many people believe that Africans were, quote unquote, kidnapped out of Africa. Will the lack of a red wave during the midterms lead to a more emboldened Joe Biden? More wasteful government spending? Higher taxes? How will you protect your hard-earned savings from the reinvigorated left? The answer? Gold. Gold is the world's oldest, most proven form of currency. It's there for you when inflation soars, when other assets go sideways. And that's why Birch Gold is so thrilled to introduce a new product that reimagines gold as currency, the Gold Bag. This month, you'll get a free gold bag for every $5,000 purchase when you convert an existing IRA or 401k into a precious metals IRA with Birch Gold by December 22nd. Birch Gold will help you own gold and silver in a tax-sheltered account. Visit LarryForGold.com to claim your free info kit on gold. Then talk to one of their precious metal specialists. Plus, with every purchase you make before December 22nd, you're going to get a free gold bag. This is a great stocking stuffer just in time for Christmas. Once again, visit LarryForGold.com. That's LarryForGold.com. Protect your savings with gold today. Now, recall when Ben Carson became the HUD secretary and said this about slaves versus immigrants?
Land of dreams and opportunity. There were other immigrants who came here in the bottom of slave ships, worked even longer, even harder for less.
Now, then President Obama said almost exactly the same thing.
Life in America was not always easy. It wasn't always easy for new immigrants. Certainly it wasn't easy for those of African heritage who had not come here voluntarily, and yet in their own way were immigrants themselves.
Now Carson got hammered. He's insensitive, doesn't understand the difference between a slave and an immigrant, and of course the kidnap thing in particular. Now, Obama didn't get hammered because Obama's a Democrat. You know how that rolls. But as to Carson and the kidnapped angle, here's what one critic said. Quote, immigrants booked passage and came to these shores in steerage, enduring heat, stench, and cramped conditions in hopes of better lives in America. Slaves were kidnapped and came to these shores shackled, lying cheek to cheek in their own body waste. End of quote. Kidnapped? And writing for the 1619 New York Times Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones said the same thing. Quote, in August 1619, just 12 years after the English settled Jamestown, Virginia, 1 year before the Puritans landed at Plymouth Rock, and some 157 years before the English colonists even decided they wanted to form their own country, the Jamestown colonists bought 20 to 30 enslaved Africans from English pirates. The pirates had stolen them from a Portuguese slave ship that had forcibly taken them from what is now the country of Angola. So far, so accurate. But these men and women who came ashore on that August day were the beginning of American slavery. They were among the 12.5 million Africans who would be kidnapped from their homes and brought in chains across the Atlantic Ocean. 12.5 million Africans kidnapped? You see, this kidnap narrative was made popular by the 1970s miniseries Roots, in which the protagonist, Kunta Kinte, was kidnapped by a raid led by a white man. The inconvenient truth is that most black slaves taken out of Africa were captured in war and were sold to European and Arab slavers by African chieftains, or they were captured in raids conducted by black profit seekers and then sold to European and Arab slavers. This is what a Nigerian novelist wrote about her father, telling her a story about her great-grandfather. Here's what she said, quote, "Records from the transatlantic slave trade database, directed by historian David Eltis at Emory University, showed that the majority of captives brought to the U.S. came from Senegal, Gambia, Congo, and eastern Nigeria. Europeans oversaw this brutal traffic in human cargo, but they had many local collaborators. The organization of the slave trade was structured to have the Europeans stay along the coastlines, relying on African middlemen and merchants to bring slaves to them," said Toyin Falola, a Nigerian professor of African studies at the University of Texas at Austin. The Europeans couldn't have gone into the interior to get the slaves themselves. The anguished debate over slavery in the U.S. is often silent on the role that Africans played. That silence is echoed in many African countries where there's hardly any national discussion or acknowledgement of this issue, end of quote. So this African writer, whose great-grandfather bought and sold slaves, says, "Do not judge us by the prism of today's standards, but we're supposed to judge white people who did bad things in the past by the prisms of today's standards and extract money from people who were never slave owners and give it to people who were never slaves?"
As much as slavery is repudiated around the world today, prior to the 18th century, I know of no serious effort to abolish the institution anywhere.
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 Not in Africa, not in the Arabian
Not
world.
in Africa in the 21st century. Even in the antebellum South, most whites did not have slaves. The cost of one male adult slave was more than the average white person earned all year. So they weren't all living in terror with their plantations and all the rest of it. And what we're looking at is if slavery is something that happened to one race of people in one country, when in fact the spread of it was around the world. In 1776, which is when Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, as well as when the United States got started, he said that Western Europe is the only place in the world where there is no slavery. And even the Western Europeans had vast numbers of slaves in the Western Hemisphere,
yes,
but not in Western Europe itself. And so if you're going to have reparations for slavery, it's going to be the greatest transfer of wealth back and forth, and between and cross-hauling, as they say in the railroads, because the number of whites, for example, who were enslaved in North Africa by the Barbary pirates exceeded the number of Africans enslaved in the United States and in the American colonies before that, put together. But nobody is going to North Africa to ask for reparations because nobody is going to be fool enough to give it to them. Here we have intellectuals who can imagine a different history from the rest of the world, even though it's so similar to the rest of the world.
Back to the Nigerian writer. Her father told her, quote, "If anyone asks me for reparations, I will tell them to follow me to my backyard so that I can pluck some money from the tree there and give it to them," end of quote. So no reparations, says this writer, from Africa for the involvement in the slave trade by Africans, but there ought to be reparations from Americans for being involved in the slave trade here? Can you say double standard? Now, Hollywood is Hollywood, and one ought not expect historical accuracy. But it is a flat-out lie to refuse to acknowledge, even deny, that the European and Arab African slave trade required the complicity of Africans. It did. Now remember, you can always call the show, 888-971-7243, 888-971-SAGE. And remember, we've got a country to save. I'll see you next time.